Okay. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, on Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, on Stitcher, on SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Stellan Vinthagen. He is an expert on the science of resistance and nonviolence, and he's described himself as a scholar activist seeking to undermine white supremacist, capitalist, militarist, hetero-patriarchy. It's a mouthful, but good stuff. He's at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and he describes himself as, until mid-December, I am based on Turtle Island, or United States of America, as a guest on traditional First Nation Pakumtuk and Nipmuc land. And I love that you do that. And I've been going to more and more conferences where people, when they speak, they talk about acknowledging the Native American hosts and the tribes that originally had that land. I think that's great that you do that. He's an endowed chair in the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance, professor of sociology at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and at University of Gothenburg as well. He is the co-editor of a book series on resistance studies published by Roman and Littlefield. He's the editor, Journal of Resistance Studies, director, Resistance Studies Initiative, steering group, Resistance Studies Network, International Council, War Resistors, and the list goes on. His latest book is Researching Resistance and Social Change, a Critical Approach to Theory and Practice. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Rob.
No, you're supposed to go, no, I'm resisting that.
No, I'm not resisting everything. I resist only the things that are dominating us and creating injustice.
No, I got to hear you present at the Peace and Justice Studies Conference maybe a month ago, and I really enjoyed your presentation. And I think you're doing fascinating and important work you study how resistance happens, how it works, how people do it. Tell me a bit more about what you do and the science and the goals behind it in terms of...
Right. So I think we need a lot more knowledge in order to be more efficient and also create the world we would like to have. There are a lot of problems with the reproduction of dominance and injustice within our own resistance and protest when we're trying to create social change. And then I think a part of that knowledge exists out there among activists, the street professors, I would say, the people that acquire knowledge from hard experiences with struggling with domination and injustice. But also those of us that are privileged enough to have a paid job where we can systematically look at cases in history and at different places in the world that work at the universities. I think we have an ethical responsibility to chip in and do what we can in order to contribute to what we need to know in order to fight in a more efficient way. So I have devoted my academic work, my research, writing, to the service of people that fight for human liberation. But let me first say that I don't do that in a way that I think that I serve the movements in a way of being a megaphone that is just uncritically portraying what they want to achieve. I think my role and the role of critical friends within academia is to point towards weaknesses, ineffectiveness, and problems. The reproduction of domination and injustice within our movements, and try to point towards possible solutions. Because these are the things that very often activists don't have the time and the luxury to systematically research and figure out. So in my work, I have been looking at, for example, anarchist groups in Germany and how they, in their work, reproduce power. I worked tightly together with them, and I pointed out problems, and that was used in their discussions. I did the same with a movement I was very involved in, the Plowshares movement, that is doing direct disarmament of nuclear weapons and weapon export, inspired by the US Plowshares movement. That was a movement that was going on for some 15 years in Europe. So I did that in looking at the work of these groups, trying to see how they were reproducing injustices in forms of male domination or sectarian tendencies and so on, and pointing these problems out and showing that some groups were trying to solve that or deal with it by diminishing these kind of problems.
So what you're basically saying is some activist groups have their own problems with domination and patriarchy and male domination.
Exactly.
Within them, they're replicating them.
Yeah. So even those groups that are clearly fighting for feminism, for racial justice, for abolishing class domination, will have some problems of their own. We have seen that in so many movements, not just in revolutions that are, so to speak, eating up their own children after the revolution. But we also see it in classical struggles, like, for example, how the early feminist movement was a very white middle-class movement that got criticized by women in the South, by Black women, for being dominated by a very particular group of women. We saw the same happening in the workers' movement in Europe, in trade unions, how they were radical when it came to the class analysis, but they were heavily patriarchal. And they became also very strongly bureaucratic. And with time in my own country, Sweden, where I come from, they became very integrated into the political power in society and became very reformist, losing very much of their socialist agenda on the way. So this happens again and again, how ordinary members are being betrayed by leadership, not just because there is a corruption happening, but because the perspective is very different from the top of a pyramid of a leadership. But also, these kind of issues, I think, needs to be taken seriously if we want to have movements that fight for true human liberation, that is not just for one group that is trying to get their rights.
Well, you make me think, I call the show the Bottom Up Show because I think we're transitioning from a more top-down dominated culture to a more bottom-up one that's been catalyzed by the internet and smartphones. Humans before civilization were very bottom-up and lived in relatively interdependent, cooperative, egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands for most of their existence.
Yeah.
Civilization brought the benefits of being able to build massive roads and big projects. It also brought with it a lot of top-down negatives like hierarchy and slavery and centralization and what have you. And
exactly, and we are in the middle of a fundamental crisis for humanity because of this. Because these kind of structures are now undermining our environment and the climate in such a way that the future is in question mark.
Okay, yeah, and so what I hear you saying is that even people who want to engage in grassroots bottom-up change, it's almost like they get stuck. I mean, you're not putting blame on these people. You're saying that it just I think a lot of it just happens because people are so accustomed to growing up in an authoritarian system that
exactly.
it's a kind of a cultural, structural challenge for people attempting to make change happen, that they've got to face themselves and look in the mirror as well as resist the system that's outside them.
Exactly. I think that's what makes it so difficult. I mean, there was perhaps a period when people fighting for human liberation thought it was enough to get away with the physical bodies of the elites of a class domination or so. And then the freedom would come. But today we know that the domination and the injustices in our society is consisting of so many dimensions at the same time. It's race, it's class, it's homophobia, it's gender, it's caste, and it's ableism, and it's so much of different kinds of domination. And at the same time, this is not just a kind of a physical organizational domination. It also happens through discourse, our language. So the way we are being socialized as small people when we grow up will form us, of course. And particularly if you are someone like me that is white, middle class, coming from a privileged background in Scandinavia, and you're male, of course, that will infuse and influence you. So we should not be surprised of this. So what we need to do is to have a resistance also inside of resistance movements, where we are prepared to and understand that we need to grapple with and try our best to liberate ourselves from the inner dominations that happens in our movements and in our own personalities.
I had an experience this summer. I was at a conference that was keynoted by Vandana Shiva, who is an extraordinary rock star of social change in the world, really. And I got up, there was a time to ask questions, and I raised my hand, and the person walking around the microphone handed me the mic, and then somebody says, "Wait a second. We learned in Occupy that the men and white men, older, and particularly older ones, they have the privilege. They always get it first." And they said, "Okay," and they handed it to a woman of color. And I had already stood up and was about to speak, and it made me realize that it's part of my job. I mean, I want to speak, and I had questions, but we, as the people, the white males who have the power, have to take a responsibility for making sure that we don't abuse it as well.
Exactly. I think that's a very good example you're giving. And it's also an interesting example because it shows how we can figure out models of how to do it differently. It's not a matter of silencing totally white older men like us, but it's a matter of who do you give the voice in the first place, and how do you make sure that it is an inclusive discussion where not certain groups dominate.
And I think, when I think about it, and I didn't do anything wrong. I raised my hand and I asked a question, but but it's the system and the history that was wrong. And so I stood there, and a line of women got up, and they each gave their questions or their comments. And after maybe 4 or 5 of them, 2 of them handed the mic to me. "Okay, you can go now."
Yeah, very good. Beautiful.
It was really beautiful. And I thanked the woman who, at first, when she said, "Wait a second," it was like, I had this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. And it was really kind of a little awkward, but she was right. And afterwards, I thanked her and had a great conversation with her about it.
Uh-huh.
And I realized now that if that happened to me again, what I would probably do if I was the first one to be picked is say something like, "I don't want to be first. I want someone who is a woman or a person of color to go ahead of me. And I'm going to take this mic and hand it to somebody else, and I'll raise a question in a little while."
Great. That's great.
Yeah.
So I love your example because it also shows that something reflective happens in that space when that question is being pointed out, but in the discussion. And I think, and this is one of the points where I think I have a lot of inspiration from Mohandas Gandhi. So he was suggesting 3 strategies for changing society that I think is still valid and something we need to return to. And he was saying that, first of all, we need to build up the new institutions and structures of the new society we would like to have. Secondly, we need to resist those structures and those kind of dominations that are hindering us from realizing that new society. And thirdly, we need to work on the personal transformation of ourselves as individuals.
That's
and
great.
I think these three things are still making a lot of sense. It's a matter of, as Naomi Klein is saying, the yes and the no of the movement, the building up and the tearing down. Us creating the new ways of living, our new way of, for example, like your example here, having discussions that are more inclusive, we are creating new structures. But we need to fight against the domination and exploitation that is destroying people and our planet. But we also need to recognize that we are part of the problem and the solution, and therefore we need to work on ourselves as individuals as well.
Yeah,
that's been too often reserved to a kind of a new age or bourgeois project of individual self-preoccupation, navel-gazing into yourself. But that could actually be part of the collective self-liberation as well. I mean, as Frantz Fanon was saying, we need a new human within the revolution. The new humanism is a radical approach where we also need to see that we need to change along the revolutionary struggle that we're doing.
And we need to be aware that as that revolutionary struggle happens, we need to be changing.
Yes.
And be conscious of our need to do that as we evolve. So you in your book, you have a chapter or a section on defining and categorizing resistance. How do you do that?
Well, firstly, I want to say that we need to define and categorize in order to know what we're talking about. It helps communication. Secondly, I don't believe in the one and only definition. There is not one that is correct. As a matter of fact, I think we need to approach definitions in the way that they are tools. So we need different tools for different things. So in order for us, the aim with our tool and our definition in that book and in our work within the Resistance Studies Network, which is a global project, is to expand our understanding of what is actually resistance. Because if we are limited in our understanding of it, we will also have a very limited strategy for social change. So in order to have it as broad as possible, we have said like this, that everything is resistance if it is a practice that is done by someone that is subordinated in a domination of some kind. And if that practice has any kind of potential of undermining, at least temporarily, that domination relation. So that means that every practice that people do, if they are subordinated, would be resistance if there is at least a possibility of weakening, undermining that domination, at least locally, at least temporarily. And you should note that in this definition, we don't talk about ideology, motives, or intentions. We don't think it is key that people have a class antagonist or a revolutionary ambition in order for it to be resistance. So let me give an example here. One of the biggest social movements, or probably the biggest resistance movement in Sweden, is the file sharing movement. So people file share on internet, music, videos, software programs, and through mainly the most known site, which is the Pirate Bay site, that has been a target for repression from Washington and from the Hollywood industry.
That's Kim.com's site, right?
No, it was run by 3 individuals connected to the pirate party in Sweden.
Okay.
So I think that's a different one, yeah. But anyway, statistics points towards 1.5 million people that at the height of this period took part in file sharing. I'm convinced that only like 5% or 3% are ideologically motivated and fight for the freedom of cultural products. And they're maybe organized in something like pirate parties that has now one representative in the European Parliament. The other 95%, they do it because they are having a desire for the cultural products, but they don't really have the money, or they find it too complicated to pay it to Hollywood, or they think it's unjust somehow to pay, and they want to share it with their friends. So there might be some kind of a political motivation, or some, very often not. Still, this is undermining the profit of the Hollywood industry and these kind of corporate interests, to the degree that they approached Washington asking them to put pressure on the Swedish government, and the Swedish government made raids that was unusual, taking their computers and putting them in prison, giving them high fines and everything. And they tried to close the Pirate Bay site. But that was impossible because these people are very skilled with the information technology. So they create what's called mirror sites all over the world. So as soon as one is closed, another one is opened. So the Pirate Bay is still running. So what I'm saying is that you can have per practice by people that are subordinated to the Hollywood industry, that are guided by desire, not political motivation, but it still will have the resistance effect.
Well, it's like if you look at, in the US, it was Napster.
Yeah.
And the outcome was iTunes.
Yep.
So,
very smart of the industry to create iTunes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it as long as it was a capitalist model where there was some money involved, it was just, it was incredibly undermining, so that I would imagine that the sales of I guess CDs now are down to a tiny fraction of what they used to be.
Right.
Yeah. So in that case, the undermining of the system produced a new system that was legal.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting example, because it's very often like this. There's a dynamic interaction between different forms and techniques of power and domination on the one hand, and different forms and techniques of resistance. Sometimes
let's get into that. Let me just do a brief show ID,
Sure.
Okay? And this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com. And you already heard it if you're watching the video, so I'm just going to pause for a moment so I can know where to edit in the soundbite for the radio show. Okay, and my guest for this show is Stellan Vinthagen, who is a scholar activist in the science of resistance and nonviolent, who is at University of Massachusetts Amherst and the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So tell us more.
Right. So we were talking about the interaction and the dynamic between different forms and techniques of power and dominance, as well as resistance, and that's the typical situation where we don't really have a final revolution anywhere, and we don't have a final defeat anywhere. But what we're seeing is an ongoing historical struggle between forms of domination and forms of resistance that takes different shape in different historical periods and different localities. And I think we can learn from this. We can learn in order to create more of freedom and equality. We can learn from these different historical battles between forces for human liberation and forces for repression. And I think that's where research comes in and becomes important. Because if you look at the military, they study every single military battle through history, and they develop their weapons, their strategies, and experiences. And the forces that are fighting for a nonviolent revolution, they need to do the same. We need to kind of learn from these experiences if we're going to be at all enough efficient in our work.
So you described it that over time, resistance has changed. What has been the arc of that change? How has it changed over time? How is it different now than it was 20, 50, 100, 200 years ago?
Well, many changes have happened. Like 200 years ago or so, demonstrations were new. Strikes were new. And it took a time until that became established and became very important for movements. And I think they have been really vital for struggle for rights and democracy. We have seen that very much in Sweden, where I come from. Historically, we can see that every kind of freedom that is now part of our constitution, religious freedom, freedom of expression, the right to vote, the right to strike, to form trade unions, all of that is connected to civil disobedient movements throughout the history. So this has been important, but I think we are today in a situation when we have a globalized society, and where many societies are, at least on paper, liberal democracies. They thrive on having visible oppositions that keep according to the law. I think nowadays it doesn't threaten any ordinary Western liberal democracy to have a demonstration from point A to point B in Washington or in Stockholm or in Brussels. We have to be really enormously a lot of people to have an impact with such demonstrations. The problem today, I think, is very much that it serves to create the legitimacy of the system. It gives the impression that we live in a free democracy. So what is a lot of the research is pointing towards today is that particularly in authoritarian societies, but also in liberal democracies, mass civil disobedience are much more efficient in creating pressures and creating social change. However, what we see, even when militarized dictatorships are falling, and we have seen many of them falling the last decades from these kind of mass movements, what we see is that they're only opening up doors for possibilities of change. Many times there are backlash, like a new military coup like in Egypt, or a civil war like in Syria, or a massive repression like in China, 89. But there are some cases where this opening of a door actually creates a democratization that is at least improving the situation, like in Tunisia, or in Eastern Europe in the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I think we need to improve these potentially very effective means by working on developing the alternatives of what kind of society we want to have after we create a situation of a downfall of a government or a pressure that is very high in creating reforms.
Well, I know somewhere I found you've said that resistance that leads towards producing something better is more effective than resistance that is about getting rid of something.
Right.
I'm not sure I got that exactly right.
Well, yes. Basically, I mean, let me say like this: it's easier to unite people if we're fighting something of a common enemy. We can create broader alliances. So if we're against a dictatorship or we are against a particular government or a particular policy, we can create broad alliances. But the problem is that if we want to have a change that is actually having a profound effect on people's daily life, that actually means that their human dignity and situation is improved, it's not necessarily enough to just unite around what we're against. In order to kind of create something that is a more sustained, real change, we also need to develop the solutions and the ideas of what we want to have instead. I think one of the tricks that is really difficult for us to figure out, both for activists and for researchers, is that we have to find something that is going beyond the small reforms here and there, and that doesn't have to involve any kind of total revolution where everything is changing. I think that is kind of difficult to figure out what that is, but there are key changes that might improve the strength of our radical movements that are striving towards a more just and democratic society that could give us a better situation. Let me give an example. Historically, I think the legalization of trade unions in Europe was very important. That was a small reform. It took a lot of struggle to get it. But once it was gotten, the trade unions could become very powerful actors in society. But they are powerful because they're using disruption, meaning the strike. And that disruption is hitting at the heart of the corporation power, namely money. At the same time as they are prepared to negotiate to create improvements for the workers. So I think it opened up a door. It legalized something that was a step forward that made the movement stronger. However, in Europe, as you might be aware, the problem became the institutionalization or the bureaucratization of the union power in the way that they became very established in alliance with the governments.
Same here in the States.
Right.
I think that's why unions have become weaker, much, much weaker, with much less people in unions now than there were a few decades ago.
Right. And we need to return to the bottom-up perspective, the grassroots organizing in what the trade unions were in the beginning.
You know, I have a feeling we could go on for a couple hours, and we've got about a half an hour left. I want to make sure that you get your most important messages out. What have you learned in the time that you've been studying resistance that you think is the most important thing for people who are in the world of change and who are trying to make change happen? What would you tell them? Now, I've got 4 pages of questions, but what's the most important thing that you want to get out?
Thank you. Well, it's obviously not easy to choose, but I would say like this, that a key lesson for me is that that we can improve the way we struggle by learning from the experiences of others that struggled in a similar situation before or at another place. So I believe very much in the interaction between experienced activists and researchers that are interested to be allies to these movements.
How's that working for you? Do activists want to hear from academicians and researchers?
Yes, it actually happens, but it's not easy to find the forums because there are also bad experiences. So let me give an example. I organized together with other people a Black Liberation retreat 2 years ago. And I'm right now in the process of organizing a similar indigenous resistance retreat in March. So what this was a selected group of 50 people coming from all over the continent, who are both the elders that were part of the struggle in the 60s, both on the Malcolm X side of things and Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, together with the young leaders of the movement for Black Lives today.
Black Lives Matter.
Yes, exactly. So they gathered in 2 full days to have an intergenerational dialogue among people coming from different organizations and discussing strategies forward with resistance. In this process, a couple of academics took part, mainly to listen, but also to give input. So it was mainly activists and some academics. And it was run by the activists that were facilitating it. And we worked through workshops, small groups, discussions, and lots of interactions together. I think that might be a model for how we can work ahead. And I'm trying to develop it now, as I said, with indigenous, different tribes, taking inspiration from Standing Rock, among other things, to, in a similar way, discuss resistance forward for indigenous groups in Turtle Island or America. And I think this could be expanded, but this is one key lesson and one thing that I would like to put forward: the knowledge and the learning from the experiences of others. And part of that response comes from experienced activists. A part of it comes from academics that are having the possibility to research this, right? A second point that I would lift up that I think is really key is that we need to have a more a stronger educational focus in our resistance struggle, where we educate each other, and all activists are getting through trainings and are learning skills. So not everyone is aware of this, but in the powerful sit-in movement within the civil rights movement in the 60s, there was a lot of training going on. People did exercises in order to prepare themselves in small groups to do a powerful action in the sit-ins, in the restaurants and lunch counters. And this made it possible for them to embody their messages and to withstand the repression, to grow even when they got arrested. But this is kind of very often lost by activists. They think that if we gather a big number of people on the street at the same time, we will be powerful. I said that I don't believe very much in legal demonstrations if we don't do disruptions. But even when we do disruptions, and even then it's even more important that we are prepared, that we have a good strategy developed from knowledge, and that we have education of all the activists so that they know what to do. I mean, the military will never go into battle without having trained soldiers. They would never go to battle without having a strategy. They will not go to battle without having developed their weapons. But it seems like many activists think that it's enough to get people out on the street. And that puzzles me. And I think that's part of our ineffectiveness, that we do things, but we are not really having a creative, knowledge-based strategy. We're not educating our activists in the way that we know exactly what we want to do.
Interesting. You know, I gotta throw in a couple thoughts here.
Yeah.
One, it's been said that to become an expert at something, it takes 10,000 hours.
Yes.
Are there many experts at resistance?
Yeah, there are actually. I would say they exist out there, the professors of the street that definitely are experts.
Professors of the street.
Yes.
I love that. Professors of the street.
Yeah, it's a term I learned and respected when I was in South Africa. So I think the problem, though, is that if you're an activist, you are underpaid or not paid at all. You live through a lot of repression, and you're struggling for your people and try to achieve some kind of results. So what happens is that people develop a very skilled knowledge and capacity on that local struggle. And they learn something from networking with others, of course. But what I think is lacking is the capacity and the infrastructure for us to learn across different movements and to learn across the different ages, so that we spread that kind of knowledge that exists out there. And I think that's part of the role for educators or trainers, but also for academics, researchers like me.
Now, you have in your book a section on organized resistance and everyday resistance.
Yeah.
Where's that fit in?
Well, we know very well what's organized resistance. We see that very clearly because it's confrontative. It's out in the street. It happens through protest, petitions, riots and civil disobedience actions, strikes, and all that, right? However, the everyday resistance, I would claim, is bigger, but it's more invisible. And the everyday resistance is very different in nature. It's something that James Scott learned and spread to others, and is part of the resistance studies field.
He wrote a book about hidden resistance, I think.
Yes, exactly.
He was a guest on the show a couple of years ago.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so his work is emphasizing the hidden nature or the disguised nature of the individualized or small group kind of resistance that is going on in the everyday.
That's bottom-up stuff too.
Very much so, very much. So this is when, for example, in very repressive environments, like during slavery or in a prison or among migrants, it will be too dangerous and even suicidal to make a public organized resistance. So instead, people are taking their opportunities to work slow, to sabotage, or to steal things when they're able to. And this form of resistance is going on in the small scattered actions of individuals all the time. This is only visible through sometimes, statistics of internal theft in corporations from the workers. You can see that in statistics, but you don't see it vocalized, because by its nature is trying to avoid being detected as resistance. So I think this is kind of the culture from where our capacity to organize mass movements come.
I think there's a kind of a top-down, everyday hidden resistance too, and we see it with disenfranchisement of voters, for example.
Right.
Making it harder for people to participate in democracy.
Right.
So it works on both sides.
Well, that's true, that there are a lot of mechanisms that are used to exclude people from participating, at the same time as we have people being disillusioned and not wanting to participate because they don't see the meaning of it. But my point here is that people that might perhaps not vote, they might still be active in their neighborhood, in their family, at their workplace with everyday resistance. And it's by its nature that this is hard to detect. And we don't have statistics on very much of this. However, we do have it on organized resistance.
Is this everyday resistance effective? Does it work? Does it produce change?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I think would make sense to have research to figure out more. So some researchers like Scott are suggesting that absolutely it can be. And he has pointed to cases where it has been. And then Asef Bayat, who is doing research on the everyday resistance of slum dwellers in the big urban cities in the third world, he's also suggesting that it can be very effective. But it's only effective when it gets enough numbers of people doing similar things. When thousands of people are doing small acts, that can accumulate into an effect that could have power.
Howard Zinn wrote that that's the way change happens, with small acts.
Right.
I love that quote.
Yeah.
Actually, I started a website, smallacts.org. I really believe that that's the way that things happen.
Wonderful. And I think if we learn to appreciate this form of resistance, that could be a way to reinvigorate the union struggle, because there are a lot of workers that are feeling exploited, that have a desire for freedom and equality, at the same time as they don't really believe in the bureaucratized unions and how they can represent them. So this is part of the project of resistance studies to give us a possibility to learn from and appreciate the many different forms of unarmed resistance that is going on in our societies. But sometimes, in some situations, the repression is so high that the only thing we can find is only these informal, hidden forms of resistance.
Right. Okay, so we're going to continue. I just need to do another show ID. So, yeah. Rob Call, Bottom Up Show. I'm going to pause for a moment. And my guest for the show is Stellan Vinthagen, who is a professor and researcher in the science of resistance and nonviolence at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about disruption and undermining. You got a science going there?
Yes, absolutely. We see then the clearest examples we have nowadays is statistics from colleagues of mine that have shown through looking at resistance campaigns the last 100 years of all available campaigns where people have been trying to overthrow dictatorships.
Wow.
Some 400 cases, both armed and unarmed. And they are showing that it's double as effective to use unarmed means to overthrow these dictatorships, even if they are militarized. That's surprising for some people that tend to believe that armed struggle is more powerful than unarmed struggle. But this reason comes from the mass participation of people and using disruption. That's the kind of the key of the strength of these movements.
What kind of disruption? Is there a pattern?
Well, people tend to, as citizens, to use their power of using civil disobedience, occupations, and non-cooperation. As workers, they strike, and as consumers, they boycott to buy things. So if you take these things together, it's actually undermining the power of corporations and governments. So there is a limit to how much people can be repressed. There's a need for even a militarized dictatorship to have the collaboration of ordinary people, because it's ordinary people that produce in their factories, right? Sure. And they don't have space for millions of people in prison. So actually the research is pointing towards that it's enough for about 3.5% of the population to engage in sustained disruption and protest to force a government to resign.
But what I'm hearing, though, is the protest is absolutely not enough.
Exactly. The protest is not enough. It needs to be a big number of people. And in a dictatorship, they are vulnerable for protest, because if people are breaking their fear and often a state of emergency and still go out on the street, the dictatorship is afraid that will spread to other people, right? But in a liberal democracy, we have to understand that it thrives on the legal protest. So as long as the legal protest is not big and really substantial, which means millions of people in a protest, like in the US, to go up to 3.5%, it will actually only sustain the regime, even if it's an oppositional protest. So what we need is disruption in the terms of civil disobedience, boycotts, and strikes. That is what would make the everyday function of the system disrupted.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. I did an interview with a guy, Keith Farnish. Are you familiar with him?
No.
He wrote a book about undermining. and he talks about legal and illegal things. Some of them are civil disobedience, and some of them are just illegal, like putting chains on parking lots in front of stores and things like that.
Right.
And I got to say, it made me a little uncomfortable because he is talking about some things that are illegal. But what I'm hearing from you is that, yeah, we got millions of people out in the Women's March, and hundreds of thousands of people wearing the pink hats, the pink pussy hats, and that's just not going to cut it.
No, particularly not when we are talking about an entrenched economic and political elite that is having such a strong power grip of the United States. I mean, Princeton showed in a study several years ago that the United States is actually not a democracy, but it's a plural elite competition. So I think we have to recognize that we are in a struggle where it's very difficult to create change. And particularly if you don't have millions of people that are doing sustained protest, we need definitely to have disruption in order to create the kind of popular pressure that could create some change. But I'm saying that is not enough either. We need to also have some kind of a vision and develop the ideas of what kind of society do we want instead.
No,
let me just say that's where I find it very inspirational with the movement for Black Lives Matter, when they put out their visions about the different society.
What do they put out?
So there are ideas about not just reform of the police, but as well community land trusts, which would increase the possibility of Black folks owning land and creating affordable housing. They had visions about the healthcare system, about education, about cooperatives, and so different things.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. One of my quotes that I have on my signature for my email is from Buckminster Fuller. You don't fight the system and try to change it, you replace it.
Right, exactly.
And I was really inspired by Malcolm Gladwell's book on Samson and Goliath, where he cited research that showed if you try to go up against a very powerful enemy using their weapons and their strategies, you're going to lose most of the time.
Yes.
But even if they have 10 times more power than you, and you use an alternative approach like David did with Goliath,
yeah,
and then even people who are even groups going up against powers 10 times more powerful can win 60 or 70% of the time.
Right.
So
no, that's very important, and that's exactly what nonviolent resistance builds on. It builds on changing the playing field and enter into another kind of struggle, where our numbers and our creativity in creating life-affirming resistance is replacing the kind of violent game which we would always lose if we would enter an armed struggle with those powerful militarized states. And we have to remember that this is the way that the capitalists did 500 years ago. They were creating their banks and they were creating their trade systems in a very small scale. And that spread. So they had ideas of a different economic system. And then with time and with revolutions, they could also institutionalize that.
Now you talk about NGOs as co-opters.
Well, yes, because I think we have to be aware that we don't only have problems with domination going on in the economy through the corporations and the strong multinational corporations, and then in the politics through the governments that don't really listen to the voice of the people. But we also have that in civil society. We have very powerful non-governmental organizations that are trying to put forward their own agenda, maybe with a very good aim, very good intentions maybe, and maybe they're achieving also good results in a certain area. but they are groups then that are not necessarily connected to any kind of grassroots membership control, or are having any kind of holistic interest in the context where they work. So the typical problem here is a number of Western NGOs that goes into Afghanistan or Iraq in war zone situations and are trying to help out with people's problems. Very often they have very little of local influence. Very often they have very little of local knowledge. And that can create problems that we need to be aware of. I'm not saying that all NGOs are necessarily corrupting or are part of the problem. I just think that we need to be aware that even non-governmental organizations can be part of domination. Kind of, you know, in the same way as missionaries were during colonialism. They had a lot of good intentions, but they were also spreading a colonial domination through the culture and religion.
Absolutely. So, and when I was at the Peace and Justice conference, other people were talking about how nonprofits can really sabotage change. And right. I think my personal experience with it is that I publish opednews.com, which is a left of liberal, left of maybe even a progressive site that is very critical of the system we have here and of the Democrats and the Republicans. And there's no way we're going to get funding from liberal foundations. It's just not going to happen because we right. do things and say things and publish things that they're not comfortable with. And I think that the problem is that all these NGOs, they need to be too comfortable. Right,
exactly. And then I would say that most of them, they have such a limited agenda of what they want to change. So it's not such a big problem for them. But some of them, they will understand that they can only do certain things with that kind of funding while they are critical to it and they're trying to do other things with other funding or without funding. And I think that's what we need. We need those that can play that game, but are not bought into that the agenda is only the liberal human rights agenda.
Yeah. You talk about how dominance is built on some form of cooperation.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, I think we have to be aware that even when we are critical, the system that we live under, particularly capitalism, is dependent on our collaboration. So capitalism would never work if we didn't buy their hamburgers. They will never create machines that eat their hamburgers, but they will create machines that replace the workers. So the consuming power is tremendous here.
I have a simple piece of advice for people on how to fight that. Stay out of the middle aisles of the supermarkets. All the processed foods made by these giant multi-billion-dollar companies. That's a simple way to start.
All right. That's a good advice. But it's important that we understand that any organization, be that a corporate organization or a government or a powerful NGO, actually depends on that ordinary members of that organization do their work.
All right. And we need a wrap.
Yes.
Any final words?
Well, the only thing would be that to say that developing the knowledge about resistance from both activists and academics, spreading that knowledge through education and trainings, then we will be in a much better place for our liberation struggles.
I agree 100%. My guest for this show has been Stellan Vinthagen, the professor who studies the science of resistance and nonviolence. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rob.